Well, hello. It is great to be with you at a City on a Hill. My name is Andy Bannister, and I am the director of an organisation called Solas, which does two things. Firstly, at Solas, we help churches and Christians to get the message of Jesus out of the four walls of the church and into the world outside. And then, secondly, we help train and equip and teach Christians to feel a bit more confident about talking about their faith at work, at school, at university, with friends, and with family. You see, when it comes to talking about the faith, the hope that we have in Jesus, we live in challenging times. We live in a difficult culture, a culture that is deeply confused. It's confused about spirituality, it's confused about gender and purpose, identity, truth, sexuality, religion. No wonder many of us are perhaps despairing or nervous or just plain baffled about how we might talk relevantly about Jesus in today's age. But more than all of those things, I think when it comes to religion and to faith and to spirituality, we live in a culture of apathy, don't we? Many people, if your friends are like mine, many people I meet today are not hostile to faith, but they are perhaps simply apathetic. They're a bit like an old friend of mine. John was his name. He had grown up in a Christian home, and he'd walked away from his faith as a teenager. By the time we became friends, John didn't merely not know what he believed, but that didn't really bother him. I remember during one of our first conversations about faith, John said to me, he said, I don't care about God. And as I pressed back, he fleshed this out. He said, well, why do I need God? Life is great. I'm happy. He said, I'm happy, life is fun. John told me he had the money he wanted, the women he wanted, the job he wanted, the car he wanted. Life is amazing, he said. I am just not interested in God. And I suspect perhaps many of you have friends or family members who perhaps are a little bit like John. And starting spiritual conversations with them can sometimes feel like nailing Scotch mist to the wall, quite frankly. But thankfully, there's a very helpful passage in the book of Acts that can help us with that. And we've had that read to us earlier in the service. But if you've got a Bible with you, do open it up to Acts 17, 16 through 34, and you can follow along as I make reference to it. And in that famous passage in the book of Acts, we find Paul in Athens. And I want to suggest to you that there are actually four lessons that we can learn from what Paul did here in his mission trip to Athens. Four simple lessons we can learn from how he engaged the culture of his day. And remember, Paul's culture was likewise a culture of deep confusion. It was a culture with 1,001 ideas jostling for attention. Yet it was also a world in which most people were not bothered about Christianity. They were totally apathetic, if they had even heard of it at all. So what can we learn from what Paul does here in Athens in Acts 17? Well, lesson number one is that we have to take the time to understand. After all, look what Paul does in Athens. Luke tells us that he begins by taking the time to walk around the city. He walks around, he does the tourist thing, he looks at the culture, he figures out what the people he's about to be speaking to, what do they believe, what do they care about. And we can do exactly the same in our culture. We can listen. We can observe the stories and the films, music, art and news. We can, as one preacher remarked, pray with a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. In fact, if you have a spare moment at some point, do check out the Solas website. We put the link at the start. And we're running a series this year called Undercurrents, where we're showing you how you can talk about your faith through movies and TV and popular culture. So, in terms of coming to understanding people, when we come across people who believe differently to ours, whether they have another faith or no faith, the first thing we can do is take the trouble to find out what they believe. A friend of mine had a new colleague join his workplace who was a Muslim. So my friend Nick looked for an opportunity to get to know him. And then one day, over lunch, he said to his new colleague, he said, I hope you don't mind me asking, but you're a Muslim, right? And his colleague said, yes, I am. And Nick continued, he said, I've never really talked much to Muslims before. Would you mind telling me, what is it you believe? I'd love to know. And then Nick listened. He asked lots of questions and listened carefully. And in time, that gave him the opportunity to say, this is fascinating. I'm a Christian. So we have some things in common, but some things I believe very differently. And he had a beautiful opportunity to talk about what he believed as a Christian. See, over the years, as I've engaged in this, I've found the following 4 questions can be helpful to try and weave into conversations with friends and colleagues as you try and find out where they're coming from. These questions are really helpful. Do you believe there's a God, and what is he like? Who or what are human beings? What has gone wrong with the world, and what's the solution? My friend John, who I described earlier, who was apathetic about the first of those questions, nevertheless certainly had views on the other 3 questions on that list, and in time that was able to open up conversations about that first question about God. So lesson number 1 is to take the time to understand. Second lesson we learned from Paul in Athens is to take the time and take the effort to go where people are. You know, when it comes to reaching our non-Christian friends and family and colleagues, we cannot just sit back and wait for them to come to our churches. And we see Paul model this in verse 17, where he goes to the synagogues, he goes to the marketplace, he seeks to bring Jesus into the public square, not to wait for people to come to him. See, we live in an age that encourages us to privatize our faith, to make our faith in Jesus something we do at church or at home, but not something for the workplace, not something for school or university. And so we can be tempted, therefore, to keep a bit quiet about our faith for fear of what might happen if we were to stick our heads above the parapet. One way I used to do this in the workplace, back in the days when I worked for the NHS, it went like this. I was a bit of a fearful Christian. So I thought to myself, okay, what I need to do is to try to be a really nice person. You know, if I work really hard and become a model friend and a perfect colleague, if I was terribly nice and served my colleagues well, if I washed up everybody else's coffee mugs, if I mentored younger staff members, if I volunteered to run the interdepartmental extreme snakes and ladders league or something, you know, somehow my behaviour would draw people to Jesus. But the problem I discovered is that nobody ever connected my behaviour to Jesus. See, if you are a nice, friendly, super helpful person at work, and I hope you are, your colleagues won't automatically think, oh, I bet they're a Christian. They will simply think, what a lovely person. And ironically, what you do actually is you end up drawing the attention to you and not the attention to Jesus. So how can we bring our faith more into the places we spend Monday through Saturday? Well, an easy first step that I learned from a friend of mine who also works for the NHS is to try and do what she calls flying a faith flag. Find simple ways to gently signal that you're a Jesus follower. One way to do this in the workplace, for example, is the what did you do on the weekend conversation. You know, when you're asked that question at work or whatever tomorrow or during the week, don't just talk about your brilliant Saturday, you know, that you went and played football and saw a great movie in the evening and had a great, or all the fun things you did on Sunday afternoon, had a barbecue, hung out with friends. Also talk about the fact, and be bold and say, hey, I went to a great church service on Sunday. It was great hanging out with other people who follow Jesus. Music was really good. The sermon was interesting. Just be very positive and include what you did on Sunday in your description of the weekend. I have friends who do that regularly and have found it is amazing, actually, the gentle opportunities that does open up at work. And at the same time, of course, be praying regularly for God to create opportunities for you at work or school or university or with your friends, your neighbours, your family. And then as you go into those places or hang out with your friends, keep alert for the Lord answering those prayers for opportunity. So we've seen about the need to take the time to understand. We've seen the need to go where people are. Third lesson we learned from Paul here in Athens, find the points of contact. See, Paul does this brilliantly in Athens, right? He finds a point of contact he can build a bridge from. And he does it with the altar to the unknown God. You know, rather than get angry at all of the pagan polytheistic paraphernalia that clutters Athens, Paul sees the altar that has been built to an unknown God. And he finds a way to build a bridge to the gospel from that point. What's the equivalent in our culture today? Well, although on the one hand the UK is very secular, nevertheless, most of your friends, your neighbours, your colleagues will be passionate or concerned or excited about a whole range of things that, get this, only actually make sense if God exists, if Christianity is true. You see, if we live in a godless universe, if we are literally just a 1% bit of pollution in the universe, to quote the famous well-known atheist Lawrence M. Krauss, if we are just molecules and particles, then most of the things that we and our friends believe are absurd. Let me illustrate what I mean. I have a friend who is a religious studies teacher in a high school in the south of England. And as a Christian teaching in a secular school, he has to be quite careful how direct he is about his faith. But John, not all my friends are called John, incidentally, but the two I used in this talk are, John has found that if he asks kind of wandering and pondering questions that gently get people thinking slightly, he can open up all kinds of conversations. Let me show you an example. On one occasion, John was teaching a class on ethics to a group of 15-year-old students. And to illustrate a point about human rights, he put up on the screen the cover of Time magazine from the 9th of August 2010. That very famous cover shows the mutilated face of Bibi Asia, who was a young Afghani girl who was forcibly married off to a Taliban warlord in his 50s. He horribly abused her, so she ran away from that forced marriage, was recaptured by the family. They cut off her nose and they cut off her ears and they left her to die in the wilderness. Thankfully, she was rescued by United Nations aid workers, her life saved, and she got given reconstructive surgery. But that is a striking image on the cover of that magazine, and as the class processed it, John asked a simple question. He said to the students, who here thinks that what was done to Bibi Asia was wrong? He said, thankfully, every hand in the class went up. It is never a good day when you discover a psychopath lurking in at the back of 5B. But John didn't stop there. He asked his teenage students, he said, okay, why is it wrong? There was a long silence before finally one student raised their hand and said, well, it's not right, Mr. Broadbanks, sir. It broke her human rights. Great answer, Kevin, he said. Brilliant, but why is it wrong? Why is it wrong to violate her human rights? Another student said, well, it just is, sir. It just is, said John. Have you ever wondered, though, why is it? I mean, what is it that's so magical about humankind that we have this special set of rights? What is it that means if you have human DNA, you get granted value and dignity that we don't grant to lettuces and camels and aardvarks and centipedes and so on? Have you ever wondered why that is? And he said this really amazing conversation and discussion developed, and at the end of it, he was very naturally able to say to the students, do you know, when it comes to human rights, I wonder if we need to think very carefully about what we believe. If you believe in God, it is much easier to understand rights and dignity. God created us with those things. On the other hand, if you don't believe in any kind of God, and you think we're just a cosmic accident, they really don't make a lot of sense. Well, not merely did that use of a kind of wandering kind of question lead to lots more conversations over the following weeks, it also opened up an amazing conversation with his departmental head who had been in the class observing the lecture, or the lesson. Later in the staff room, this colleague, who up to this point had been a self-described agnostic, he just didn't know what he believed, actually opened up and said to John, you know, that was an amazing discussion back there in the class. He said, you know, it never occurred to me that so many things do actually stand on belief in God and human rights. He said, you're right, it's a ludicrous idea if God does not exist. Maybe I need to think a bit harder about these things. And that's another conversation that then developed. And the same thing that John was tapping into there in the class, I think applies to so many things that your friends and your neighbours, your colleagues are concerned about. I mean, we've just talked about the whole idea of justice. You know, why does justice matter? Why does justice matter if we are just atoms and particles? Have you ever wondered? We can ask people. Why does beauty move us? I love the outdoors. I'm a great hiker and mountain climber, and I've often asked people this question. Why does beauty move us if our only purpose is survival and reproduction? Related to this, why should we bother caring about the environment? Why do human beings have this responsibility that other animals don't to the world around us? Where does that responsibility come from? Why is it there? Have you ever wondered? Why do we get so upset about greed? After all, if we live in a godless world, Surely the person who dies with the most stuff has won the game, right? It's interesting, for the last year or so on the Solas website, we've been running a series called Have You Ever Wondered? Where we take these kind of questions: justice, meaning, beauty, a love of stories, and so on, and explore the issue of, have you ever wondered why those things matter to us? These are great videos and articles to share with friends and colleagues, or just make use of the material in them yourself. And they're very gentle ways of starting spiritual conversations and building bridges, just like Paul did here in Athens. Well, we've seen that we should take the time to understand. We've seen we need to go where people are. We've talked about finding the points of contact. Finally, connect the conversation to Jesus. That's the fourth lesson from Paul here in Athens. Paul has done all these previous steps, but at the end of the encounter, he uses the resurrection to make the connection to Jesus. And bringing Jesus naturally into the conversation is crucial. So many of our friends and colleagues, if they think about Christianity at all, they will assume that it's a religion or a system of thought or a moral code or something of that sort. But of course, Christianity is not good advice. It's not moral advice. It's none of those things. It's not good advice. It's good news. And that's the word, of course, the first Christians chose for their message. They chose the word gospel, which literally means good news. And that news is centered around Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection. We're not trying to share arguments with people. We're trying to introduce Christ. And one way I found over the years that you can sometimes do this in conversations is to look for ways to say things like, that reminds me of something that Jesus said. Or you can find a way to, when the conversation, say, this reminds me of something Jesus did. Or that reminds me of a story that Jesus told. Last year, a colleague and I were chatting to a university student who her big obstacle to Christianity was the many examples she'd come across of church leaders abusing their power for personal gain, whether financial or sexual. And that had totally put her off the church. Of course, sadly, you don't need to do a lot of Googling to find examples of church leaders who are not so much wolves in sheep's clothing as wolves in wolves' clothing. How, this student asked, how could anybody possibly take Christianity seriously when some of its leaders behave like this? Well, there were many things I could have said in reply, but I felt the only answer with any weight at all was to put the focus not on the stupidity of humanity, but upon the beauty of Christ. And so I said, look, I share your utter disgust at these stories, not least because they are so antithetical to how Jesus behaved. I'm reminded, I said, of the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet, something that was unheard of for a Jewish leader to do. We then talked a little bit about what servant leadership looked like, and I was also able in time to add, I said, this also reminds me of what Jesus did on the cross. Here was somebody with ultimate power, but who laid it all down, who did not victimize others, but who himself became a victim in order to serve and rescue us. And I said, look, any leader whose leadership does not remind you of that or make you think about that, quite frankly, does not deserve the label Christian. At the end of the conversation, we were able to give her a copy of Mark's Gospel. And I pointed out in that, I said, we find some of Jesus' most powerful words on this subject. From Mark 10:45, Jesus said, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. If you looked at the early church, immediately after Jesus' return to heaven in Acts chapter 1, you'd have probably thought there was no way this little project could succeed, right? You had a tiny bunch, maybe 100 or so, frightened men and women, shaking and fearful, facing a culture that was confused, a culture that was hostile, a culture where nobody had really heard of Jesus. But by AD 350, just 300 years later, the church had grown to almost 53% of the Roman Empire. See, as the first Christians took the time to do what Paul did in Acts 17, under prayer, under the power of the Holy Spirit, they listened. They went where people were. They built bridges to the gospel, and they introduced Jesus into conversation after conversation. Friends, we live in a culture where people are desperate for hope, desperate for love, desperate for meaning, identity, and purpose. And the exciting news is that the things that our friends are looking for, just in all of the wrong places, can be signposts we can use to point them forward as we seek to introduce Jesus. As that famous Christian writer C.S. Lewis so memorably put it. He said, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. If we truly believe this, then we can take the gospel into the culture, into our workplaces, schools, universities, homes, and neighbourhoods, and we can do it with confidence. Let me close in prayer. Father God, we recognise that we live in a culture of confusion, and it can be fearful. We can be fearful sometimes when we think about sharing our faith in that context. But we thank you that the gospel is true. We thank you that the gospel answers all of those deep questions of life. So forgive our fearfulness. Give us confidence today. Fill us with your spirit, and give us a love for our friends and our neighbours that compels us to begin looking to seek and find ways to begin conversations with them. Even now, would you maybe put on our hearts or call to mind for us the names of neighbours and friends and colleagues and family that you'd have us find ways to share Christ with. And then I just pray that as we take those fumbling steps, would we know that you go with us, and might we see God, you work through us to draw those that we love to Jesus Christ. And we ask that in his name. Amen.